Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of the Wandering Road podcast. I'm your host Chris, alongside my co-host Dean, and for today's show, we have a very special guest, Anna Maria Manalo, a published author in the genre of supernatural and the paranormal. Thank you for joining us today, Anna Maria. We really appreciate it.
Well, thank you for having me.
Oh, absolutely. You come highly recommended from JJ from the Southern Demonology podcast. He told me that one person you have to interview is Anna Maria. She has some crazy stories to share. So we're looking forward to this one.
We've been on a roll lately. We've been getting some really good topics and even greater guests. So I feel like we're on a hot streak. This is awesome.
So Anna Maria, why don't you quickly introduce yourself to the listeners for those that might not be familiar with you.
Okay. I actually started way back as a scriptwriter. It was basically a 3-week online course that I began with. I have no writing experience except for usual intro to English courses I had when I was in college. I won't tell you how far back that was. But what got me rolling was I used to be a UFO investigator for the Mutual UFO Network. And as a result of that, I worked and lived in Bucks County, which is here in Pennsylvania. What happened was we had over 170% more sightings in the space of a year. During that time, I was the only investigator with just another gentleman that had the entire county. And while we were patrolling and getting cases and investigating them, it dawned on me to write everything down. I had to report back to MUFON, which is the Mutual UFO Network, as you well know. But some of the cases, the people did not want their stuff reported. So I kept a separate notebook and then eventually started writing it into a book format. And that's what started me. I approached the cases that were not published at MUFON by actually putting together screenplays with them. Diversified from that into the realm of the supernatural because I had a lot of personal experiences, actually, which started when I was 2 years old. And then from there on, someone suggested to me, after I had about a dozen screenplays, why don't you write books from real investigators, put them together, and make them into like novels. So that takes me to today, and that's where I am now.
See, this is where we're at with this. I already just learning about that from you, like your background. I already knew a little bit about it, but the fact that you worked for MUFON, I actually completely forgot about that organization. And I remember hearing that all the time in the late 90s and the early 2000s. That was a really big, especially coming from, like you said, Pennsylvania. And I've got some sighting stories we could probably talk about myself as well. But I know we kind of wanted to talk more about the paranormal, but I've got to pick your brain while I have you on here.
Okay.
Whatever happened to MUFON? Are they still around?
Oh yeah, yeah. I mean, they're not really around for me anymore because I quit after a couple of years. When I was on board, it was James Carrion. And then after him, there was a sequence of other people. They still have conferences. They still have investigators on the ground. I think, met one of the investigators because I was at a paranormal conference last year. Actually, this year in January. And Eric Mintel, you probably heard of him, is one of the paranormal investigators who also plays the piano, happenstance. And he invited one of the MUFON people. So I got to meet them. Some of them had written books. I think one was what they call a section director, which is like for a particular geographic region. So they're very alive and well, as far as I know.
That's so fascinating. This is just a small tidbit before I toss it over to Chris, but my grandfather was one of the main people who reported and saw the Kecksburg incident. He was apparently Yeah, he was near the incident, and he said he actually saw, the stuff in the sky and whatnot. And he would always tell that story. I remember he would tell us growing up, but there were always a lot of strange stories about UFOs coming out of Western Pennsylvania, and my mom and I would sometimes see the lights from the backyard over the horizon that didn't really track with helicopters or military planes, like shooting lights out from them and then returning to the original light. Just really strange stuff, but that always fascinated me. So thanks for sharing that. Maybe we can get into that at some point too.
Sure.
While we're on the UFO topic, what is the strangest story that you encountered while you were working with MUFON?
Well, I will tell you, Chris, that it's probably one of the more frightening things to hear directly from people who have had these experiences. When people think about UFOs, they think about things that are like lights in the sky. It's like 500 feet above me. I saw this flash. It's a lot more than that. And the most frightening ones I've had are accounts of people who have had known people who were abducted. I've actually talked and extensively interviewed a UFO abductee, which I recorded in one of my books. I co-authored it with a gentleman by the name of Tom Conwell, and it's called The Night Visitants, which is the one I mentioned earlier in the show about avoiding talking about, because it's kind of like a cross phenomena. It's not just an abduction, it's also something else. And I got too close to the situation. I had to stop writing the book for 2 weeks. But one of the things that came across me, and this was back in 2008 during the UFO flap, was a town nearby. I won't mention the exact name of the town, but I'm closer to the Jersey side of Pennsylvania. So probably with New Hope, there are a string of towns that border the Delaware River, and one of them has a pretty sizable park, I would say. This woman happened to be an avid jogger, and she jogs 3 miles at sunset every time she comes back from work. And during the time when she was jogging, apparently she encountered something she never expected. It started this way because what happened to this woman eventually turned into something that was her own nightmare. She had parked her car off of a canal near the Delaware River. It was sunset, and normally people would find you leaving the park as opposed to coming to the park. She decided she would hazard coming to the park. She would do her 3 miles despite the fact that it's supposed to be closed. So she ended up parking, and there was no one else in the park. As she was jogging, she was approaching the canal, and she was jogging along the canal. And when she got there, she turned around, and she was probably about half a mile out now from her car. And she noticed a light that was right behind the car. She thought for some reason that her car that was parked was approached by a police vehicle. So there it was. She was afraid she was going to get ticketed. She decided to run back so that she didn't get ticketed. And as she was approaching her car, she noticed the vehicle was above her car, not behind it. So she starts running to get into her car. Bear in mind, this is now nighttime. There's nobody else in the park but her. So she's running to the car. Her mind is not computing why this vehicle is above her car and not behind her car. As she reaches for her door and she's clicking it open, she's struggling to open it, finally opens it. Something materializes out of the lighted vehicle. She notices it's one straight light. It wasn't like 2 headlights. And out of this darkness comes down this huge being. And it reaches with a wand, and it touches her. Somebody guess what this being was that was approaching her.
Was it a gray alien, or was it something much more creepier?
It's something a lot more arresting and unexpected. She said it was probably about 7 feet tall. It was looking down at her, and she was so paralyzed. She was trying to get in the car. She couldn't get in the car because it seemed like she was in slow motion. It was stalling her from moving. Dean, I could see your face from here.
Yeah, that's actually it caught me off guard. That's I'm infatuated by that story because I've never heard of a UFO interaction or like an extraterrestrial interaction where one, there was a wand involved. Two, there was a very tall being. It's usually they're small, the stories that I've heard. And three, the fact that the beings seemed to be suspended in the light or like came down from the light. In the experiences that I've heard of, it's like you get sucked up through the beam and then you're in some operating room or something on the ship. I've never heard of a being suspended and then touching somebody. So that's, I guess you were about to go into that, but like what happened to her after being touched by that wand? Did she have any kind of interaction or anything like that?
Well, Dean, I was going to say, I don't think she realized what happened until later on. What she did see was a praying mantis. It looked just like the insect. It had the eyes, it had that, narrow visage of a praying mantis, and it was all spindly, and it was like touching her with one of its feelers. And I think that's when she blanked out, because the next thing she knew, she was sitting in the car. She had her head slumped down over the steering wheel, and it was daylight. It was the next morning. And she looked up. Of course, there's nobody there. She looks at her watch. It's 6 a.m. And she's just simply terrified, like, what the heck happened to me? She looks down at her knees because she was feeling funny about her legs. And she notices these scoop marks that were going down from her knees down to her ankle, and they were uniformly the same in distance on both legs. So the person who told me the story was the boyfriend. And here's what happened. He ended up taking her to the hospital. She called out of work, obviously very, very alarmed, very distraught. Took her to the hospital. Doctor couldn't explain why she had scoop marks. They were bloodless. They were not painful. They just felt funny. And then they suggested doing a hypnotic session with her, and that's when it came out that she had seen this creature.
I'm actually intrigued by the scoop marks. When you say scoop marks, were they just kind of scratches? Were they like surface issue, or was there actually chunks of skin missing that weren't bleeding?
Well, it was like an indentation, according to the guy. It was like very round, very regular. And it was almost like if you picture an ice cream scoop, scooping into like a very tough surface of an ice cream that's really frozen. That's what they look like. And
Wow.
when he was telling me this right outside a wine store. This is right after Thanksgiving. There was a show that aired for MUFON, and I was in a segment. And apparently people were I had other stories after that. It was just incredible. People were identifying me on the street, and here I was carrying a wine bottle. And this guy's totally hysterical, jumping up and down. It's like, don't tell MUFON, don't tell. So, I promised him I wouldn't tell him her name or his name or where it exactly happened. But it made it to the book. It's part of the book, and it's history. It's probably the strangest, most bizarre case I ever heard.
I want to throw it back to Chris after this, but my last question that I really wanted to ask is, from your perspective, Anna, what do you think that in a case like this? I mean, I don't think I've ever heard of a UFO or a creature that looks like a praying mantis before in the typical genre of UFOs. So I guess my 2-part question is, have you ever heard of that before or ever again since that story? And if so, or if not, what do you think was going on? Do you think that it was kind of like maybe hypnotic suggestion that the UFO was actually trying to inject something that she wasn't actually seeing into her brain? Or do you think that it could have been that there actually was a 7-foot extraterrestrial praying mantis looking being in front of her? Like, what's your take on it?
My take on it, number one, it's unique. I haven't heard anyone else talk about it. I did mention it to our section director at the time, John Ventre. John said that he's heard of other cases where there was a praying mantis involved. He said that it's one of many kinds of aliens that seem to be seen in different parts, not just of the U.S., but around the globe. So it's unique here in PA in the sense that hers is probably the only sighting that I'm aware of. Now bear in mind, this was back in 2008, 2009, right after the flap. So there could have been other cases after that. What do I make of it? Is it really a praying mantis? I don't know. But there's also a phenomena that's called screen memory. And what that is whoever abducts people, humans, tends to try to calm them down by giving them a visual of some kind of an entity that they can easily or readily recognize. In this case, they decided they're going to make them into an insect, which I think it's kind of like crazy because, like, you want to calm us down. Don't give us an insect that's 7 foot tall. Give us something like a teddy bear or something more friendly,
I think that alien was in training, probably. Yeah. Like, they were just, he was a training alien just somewhere in the middle of Pennsylvania. It's like, and then like, oh, damn it, Bob. Why did you inject her with that member? You scooped her knees wrong. Like, you idiot.
What the heck, right?
You're supposed to scoop her elbows, man.
This is freaking bizarre. But yeah, so I think that's what that's about. I have no idea. It's really strange.
So in all the cases that you've heard with abductions and encounters, have people mainly seen grays, or have there been more encounters of like other looking type of aliens?
There are cases of grays, but there's also cases where the creature looks like something that's like an orb. It's more like a round ball of light. There was a case where kids were driving around and they were chased by 3 red orbs. And when I'm talking 3 red orbs, they actually were bouncing around. They at one point got inside the car and zoomed in from the rear view mirror out through, like through the dashboard. So these are kinds of like very odd things. And people have talked about creatures that look like they're wearing a lamp on their head, like a lampshade. So, and they're usually glowing. They're usually pretty silent. And then there's a lot of cases, the other variety, where they're just kind of like watching. They're hovering over something, usually over a body of water. There was one I personally saw, and I didn't see a creature per se, but I was driving down Route 263, and it was like 5:55 in the morning. Talk about numerology. But there's some very strange synchronicities that come around with these sightings. There could be like, in my case, it was 5:55 a.m. and I'm driving down a very empty road. And suddenly I see a triangle with a discontinuation in the middle where you could see the night sky in between and then the base of the triangle. There is a gentleman who lives probably about half a mile from where I am. Their house happens to be shaped like around like a saucer. I don't know if that had any influence on an alien getting attracted to it, but he was looking out at 4:44 in the morning out his bedroom window. He was awake, he couldn't sleep. And as he looked up, he saw something that was skimming and just cleared the cloud. And he said it was the size of a mall, like a shopping mall. And it was approaching, dropping down through the clouds, and he could see beings that were looking out through the windows of this huge craft that was like an octagon in shape. So there's some really odd stuff.
I love UFO discussion. I don't want to like take up if it's getting long-winded, or like maybe we can even get her on again if you're willing to come back, Anna. Like if you like,
sure,
come back and do a deep dive on UFOs. But I'll
Okay.
I just want to share while I have you here, and it's really like kind of itching me to share experiences, very brief, that I had when I was growing up in Western Pennsylvania. You kind of heard the one that I talked about already, but the reason I'm bringing it up is because it goes along with your story and what this gentleman saw, and what it looked like in the sky kind of matches up with something I had seen when I was younger. But the first story you kind of heard already, where I grew up in a small town like 40 minutes outside of Pittsburgh, and I would look out on the horizon at nighttime, and I would see these lights that would seemingly come out of nowhere, and they looked like typical plane lights as they're traveling through the sky, like slow, meandering, nothing really special, until it would get to like around the same location in the sky every time it happened. These lights would stop. Um, so, okay, what's the next logical thing? Okay, well, it's not a plane because planes don't stop in midair. It is likely a helicopter after that, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, but the strange thing about these lights was they would emit smaller lights underneath it. Like these smaller lights would come out below, and
Mm-hmm.
these other lights that would come out would scatter. They would go left and right. But the strangest thing was, you would think if they were flares, they would just peter out, or if they were even smaller craft, if that was a thing back then in like the late 90s, they would just go off on their own. But they always returned back up into the original light source. Like they would always come back, go into it, and then that whole light source would continue moving through the sky. I saw that a handful of times in my youth, and it always blew my mind. And that was such a strange experience I can still see out of my mind's eye. And then the very last one is probably the most exciting and creepy one I've shared on the podcast before. I don't think there's much to this. Chris thinks it's the lizard people because he blames
Ooh.
the lizard people for everything. But when I was
It is the
when I was
lizard
about,
people.
you think so? I don't know. I think it's just my hallucinating dumbass. Okay, so I'll say that the precautionary thing first. The caveat is, I have had times where I've woken up out of sleep over the years where I would hallucinate something, and sometimes I'd see a giant spider coming down over me. I think one time I said I even saw Chucky the doll like standing next to
Ooh.
my bed, and even though I saw him next to my bed clear as day, and the giant spiders weren't real because I never found a gigantic spider that was the size of a frying pan in my room. So those two things were just imaginary. But the story that I have about the alien is I woke up in the same state. I was coming out of sleep in the early morning, and I was probably 12 or 13 in my room in my mom's house, and I looked in the corner of my room, and there was just this like huge, hulking 6.5 foot lizard looking creature just staring at me from the corner of my room. And it only lasted like 5 seconds. Like I just remember waking up, seeing this weird, but it was very detailed. It had scales. It was like greenish, light greenish. There was some yellow around its belly, and it was just looking at me with these piercing eyes. And then I fell back asleep or went back under after the 5 seconds, and then woke up, and I was just like, okay. I just ignored it as a kid, but thinking back on it, I was like, huh, that was pretty scary.
How
So I don't
old
know,
were
like
you, Dean? How old were you when this happened, when you had that?
I was like 12, I must have been 12 or 13 years old.
Well, I had one report, and then I had an experience that I'll quickly tell you, and I know we have to shift to paranormal as opposed to UFOs. This is something that happened outside of LA. Joshua Tree, as you know, is really like desert. Um, a lot of people go there for vacation. So in this particular instance, my uncle and his wife were driving, and they were going on vacation. I was with them. I was riding in the back of a van. They had stopped to get some gas and get some snacks on the way. And as we were headed out there at this particular gas station, we stopped where there was a convenience store. The convenience store happens to be pretty close to Joshua Tree. A truck stopped, and where it was adjacent to where we were getting gas. And as I came out of the van and my uncle was coming out of the van, there were two people coming out, and they were very tall. They were wearing some kind of military uniform. And I thought at first I was looking at maybe props, actors who were on their way to a studio. And what was going on was they, in fact, looked like they were just getting gas. I don't know where they were headed. but it kind of mesmerized me. My uncle saw it as he was getting gas. One of them turned towards us, and it was just terrifying. Because you, Dean, had talked about lizards. This one was reptilian. It was tall. It had green scales all over his body, where the uniform had like short sleeves. You could tell the whole arm was nothing but green. It had green skin, and it looked like it had some kind of like scale armor plate on its legs, past like where its boots were, between the boots and the shorts. You could see it. I don't know. Hard to explain.
That must have been really hard to see. That's very. Have you guys ever had this experience where like you're driving in your car? I've had this a few times before, but like driving in your car and then you see another car pass you, and there's somebody or something in it that just doesn't look human, and it could be the glare, from the windshield, or maybe they could have some unfortunate malforming or whatever, some issue like that. But like I've seen a couple times in my life where someone's driving and it's just like that person doesn't look human. It doesn't even look like a being I've seen before. Chris, you look like you've got a story like that.
It's the lizard people. It's the
always
lizard
the lizard
people.
people.
It's
Freaking
the
lizards, man.
Even just her recent story. It's lizard people are a thing. You can call me crazy. I think lizard people are a thing.
They're starting to come out of the woodwork. They're just trying to integrate into society.
Yeah, I know.
They're just trying to live their life and get gas. That's all.
Yeah, but I will say the UFO stuff took me by surprise. I did not expect that to be a part of this conversation, which is freaking awesome. So
Great
absolutely love that. But Anna Maria, if you don't mind, I would like to transition to some of the paranormal experiences that you have encountered throughout your life, whether it be anything that you encountered personally or like that folks have shared with you. So what do you recall as like your earliest paranormal experience?
Okay, well, I was 2 years old, so part of this narrative comes from my mother, who actually lived through it. And we had, at the time, very close to me was my grandmother. She dealt with the aftermath, as well as my grandfather, of what had transpired. So they got the story in first person. My parents lived in a very small town. They'd probably call it a hamlet because it was the cluster of homes. In the middle of that was an apartment complex of townhouses. They were up and down homes that were kind of like all put together, kind of like a row home that you would, see in Philly. So they were somewhere in the middle of that, and they had just moved there, and apparently the apartment was just constructed. So it's fairly new, which is kind of unusual, for a type of haunting like this. My father wrote for a living. He, like me now, wrote for a living full time. And so he was one of the first people who worked from home. And he would tell my mother at dinner time that he had seen something through the window of his second floor office. And think about the apartment as being 3 bedrooms, second floor having their bedroom, and then his study in the middle, and then the nursery to the right, which is where I slept. And then below that is like all the other, living room, dining room, kitchen type thing. So his room, his study room, was sandwiched in the middle, and all across that back is a creek. And above the creek were all these huge old trees. And the windows all faced the creek on that side of the house. Even the other apartments had windows that faced the creek that way. So at dusk, he would start to see something unfold from one of these trees that were just a few yards away, facing the creek. And he couldn't bring himself to explain it to her. And then finally, he was losing sleep. He started to tell people about his experiences. He started to write poetry that had something to do with the creature. And it went, "The bird that flies is false." That was one of the poems that he wrote. My mother didn't believe him. She thought maybe he was, I don't know. At that time, the marriage was a little rocky because they were just getting used to each other. Unexpectedly, they had me. They had my grandparents, maternal grandparents, just living 3 miles away. My mother would frequently visit them, but during this period, she never told her folks what was happening to my father. Until one night, we had a live-in maid, and everybody there has a live-in maid. It's not like we're rich or anything like that. It was just one of those things. She went upstairs to come and get me and to tell my father that dinner was ready. As she opened the door to my father's study, she caught it right on time, and she started screaming to the top of her lungs. Just screaming. Of course, she was carrying me. I got to see it from what I understand. I started crying. She darted down the stairs like she was just going to faint from it. My mother was like, stop, don't get hysterical. Let me get up there and see what's going on. So she gets up there, and the creature was still at the window. Now, if you recall the Mothman prophecies that came out in the movies with Richard Gere, I don't know if you guys have a full picture of what that looks like.
That's one of my favorite movies, actually. I love that creepy movie.
Yeah.
Oh gosh, I can't stand that movie because when I first saw the movie, I was at the movies. I ran out of there because apparently I did see it, because it conjured up so many bad memories for me. So I had to leave the movie theater. I couldn't sit there. It was a doppelganger for the Mothman. If you want to look at it even more closely, there's another movie called Jeepers Creepers. So if you look at the face of that, it is pretty much very close to what he had seen looking out the window. So his story now is true because the maid saw it. My mother went in and tried to grab him away from his desk. He was looking down. He didn't want to move. He was terrified of it. She had the fortitude to grab a cross that was affixed to the far wall. This was in the Philippines, so it's like totally Roman Catholic. She grabs the cross, comes towards it. Okay, she's like 24 years old. And she puts the cross right up to it, and the thing folds itself. It covers its eyes with its wings like a vampire, and starts to kind of like just float down and effervesce towards the ground. So as it went on, months passed, and they had gotten a priest. They had all kinds of people coming in, doing all kinds of blessings, doing all kinds of rituals. It kept coming back, and then finally my father became despondent, and in 1962 he committed suicide.
Very sorry to hear that. That's very difficult.
Yeah. So I mean, if things have gone from there. We moved. Obviously, we moved out of there. My grandmother extended the invitation for us to stay with her, and we did that. And I was told it followed us into my grandmother's house, which was another site of an infestation. So now you have one infestation layering on top of another one. The house where my grandmother's house was built, my grandfather never checked into the deed to see if anything was there. But right after World War II, they started building all these homes on the street, not realizing that there were graves, dead Japanese soldiers' graves that were never taken out, and they were still there underneath the house. So
that was going to be my next question. If that area was particularly impacted during the Second World War, and you beat me to it, which is great.
Yeah, so it's one of those places you never think. Okay, it's such a small country, but it had seen so much war that every part of it is pretty much infested. I'll tell you about one that was about an hour and a half away, and my cousins live there to this day. Well, some have already left, but some still live there. Their house is right on the road where there was a Japanese massacre. It was the site of a massacre where people were pulling doors. They usually have fences, they usually have walls, but the Japanese, when they invaded, would plunder every home, rape the women, steal their stuff, kill the men, do whatever they wanted to do. I ended up visiting them. They were first cousins, so I was pretty close to them. I flew the 22 hours and stayed in a bedroom that was right at the side of the wall off of the street where these things had occurred back in 1942. But to make a long story short, in the middle of the night, I was awoken to people screaming and running in the street. And I heard boots marching, and you could hear them. You could really hear them coming. So I finally sat up, and I thought, what the heck's going on? I opened the window right above my bed, and where there was a wall, you could see, the wall was there. It was pitch dark, and yet I could hear these chains being thrown as if the wall was being pulled down. And I started yelling, what's going on out there? It's like 2 a.m. And suddenly it got deathly quiet. So the next morning, my cousins say to me, so how did you sleep last night? How was it? And I said, well, it was very interesting that you asked me that question because I woke up at 2 a.m. People were running and screaming, and there were people with their boots coming down, marching. And then somebody threw a chain over the fence and started tugging it and pulling it, trying to take it down. I opened the window, and there's nothing there. And they all started looking at each other. And they said, yep, every time we have a visitor, they get the same kind of entertainment at night.
Wow. That's like just an ultimate wave. Can I come stay there? No, I'm just kidding. Ultimate wave of knowing my dumb ass, I'd entice it to come in or something by accident. But I want to jump back, and I'm sure, Chris, you probably got a million questions, but I want to jump back really quickly to the ghoulish creature, the figure that you guys saw. And I just did some quick research, and I know that the Philippines has a lot of deep lore, which I'm actually becoming more and more fascinated with, because it's not those types of stories that really permeate the world in terms of like classical creatures and monsters and stuff. There's a lot of very interesting ones. Kind of reminds me of Indonesia. Like there's so many really minor but very rich stories. But the one that I was looking into, it sounds like what you were describing was like the vampire version in the Philippines. It's like I'm going to butcher this, but it's like the Mananagal or something like that.
Manananggal.
Yeah. Is that kind of in the same vein, or Aswang or something like that?
Well, what I was told, and a priest got involved. I mean, obviously, because there was a death and all these things were happening, a priest got involved, sat down eventually with my mother and her parents. She was only 24 years old at the time, and explained that this is actually a demon. This is actually not an elemental or any of those things, but it actually was a demonic infestation. These days, it's very tough to sell that something like that is of demonic origin, because people tend to just throw it around. People tend to overuse the term, even when it's just basically a dark entity, But the priest was very convinced that they would not allow my father's body to enter the church because of the way he passed away. It was some kind of a thing they had. But there are all kinds of sightings in the Philippines, and Aswang is your vampire. There is one that replaces itself, like takes your baby and then lies there and pretends it's your baby. I forget what it's called, but I have a story about that. Somebody actually told me about it, and this was from Thailand. This couple who was living on a plantation in the middle of nowhere. The house was on stilts, and the baby was crying. She went in to take a look at it. It was okay. But the next thing you know, the window opens, and, the window's open to the air. There's no screen, no bars. It's just a thatched roof. She goes in, and it's been replaced by, this creature with jagged teeth. So it's just... monstrous.
What's crazy is we just had, like a handful of podcasts ago, we talked to somebody from Ireland, and apparently that's a similar story that comes out of that lore from that location. It's called a changeling. So I guess to them, it's like usually it's the start of, like, it comes from fairies. Like the fairies see the little baby being taken care of like human parents, and they get envious. They want to have, one of their offspring being taken care of in such a nice way. So they change the baby out with this fairy creature that eventually becomes the new baby. But I'm just absolutely blown away because I have never heard a Thai story, like a similar Thai story to that changeling one. So that, yeah. But anyway, I just had to throw that out there.
There's a kind of like an interesting thread through all these stories. So everybody seems to have a version of their own, which tells you that it has to be valid. It's not like something that's, just made up or maybe a fairy tale. Everywhere you go, there's always, an interpretation of what a vampire looks like. People think, oh, it's just Transylvania. And it's like, no. And then the changeling, Dean, you just mentioned it. It's an uncanny resemblance. So it has to be real, has to be true.
I always ask our guests this question when it comes down to UFOs. So you have UFO experiences, extraterrestrial experiences, and you also have demonic experiences and potentially, ghosts and other creatures and stuff like that that might not be directly related to like the Roman Catholic faith. So if you package all that together, like what does that mean to you? So I always ask, like I said, I ask everybody who has so many stories about this, but like if you have a life that we occupy, like a reality, you have extraterrestrials who are potentially millions of years evolved in other places in the universe or even here. But then you also have instances where we have supernatural experiences and even specifically religious experiences with potentially demonic beings. And then you also have people in far left field reporting about Bigfoot and like other physical creatures that aren't, so like, what does that mean to you? Like, what kind of reality are we occupying where all these things seem to be happening at once?
Well, I can sum that up in one word, multiverse.
Oh,
so we
okay.
exist in what I believe a multi-dimensional reality. We're in 3 dimensions. Below us is the second, which are the animals. First dimension, you've got the plants and the rocks. Above us are all these weird things. Someone asked me, where do you think the entities that are dark reside? The ones that have evil intentions or whatever they are. And I would say the one closest to us, because it seems like they're the ones that like to tap into us and play with us and do all kinds of things that wreak havoc on our lives. They're in the 4th dimension. And my interpretation of things is, and I've read some books about this. It's hard to remember what they're called, but they're all different kinds of books, from something called Journey of Souls to things that Dolores Cannon has written about. Dolores Cannon, who has passed away several years ago, wrote several books on the topic of the multiverse. And she talks about 24 levels of consciousness. And of those, we're only in the 3rd dimension when there's actually the highest one, which is the 24th. I can't even imagine that. But that's where they all come from. I think Bigfoot is a shifter. I think he goes from one dimension into the other. That's why he's very difficult to catch. Although there is an animalistic side to him, that's flesh and blood. There's also the other side to him that seems to connect to some dimension where there's always UFO sightings where he is or she is.
Anna Maria, I wanted to circle back to something that you said a few minutes ago. You said that after you left that home where your family had that unfortunate encounter with that demon, we could call it that. You said that you guys went to go stay with your grandmother, correct? And you said that place was suffering from an infant station as well. Did you see anything there, or did anyone else tell you anything about stuff that happened there?
Yes, that would probably be a topic for an entire season, but one of the few things that I did see off the bat when I moved in was the smoking man. I had a bedroom that was on the lower floor of the house. There were about 7 bedrooms in the house. It was a pretty big house. The bedroom I was in was off of the kitchen just because for convenience during the day, they checked in on me and everything because I was just a small kid. In that bedroom, there was a window that faced the whole entire backyard. And at night, I would see something there. He resembled a silhouette, basically a dark shadow. But he would be smoking, and you could smell the smoke wafting through the window. He would never say anything. He would, he wouldn't smile or interact. He just kind of just stood there. Another one we had, and we lovingly call him, but it's really not funny, is Mumbo Jumbo. And Mumbo Jumbo sits, tattered clothing, red eyes, like pinpricks, looking out from the middle of the backyard. And it's usually one of the servants who are going out there in the middle of the night to feed the cats. We had several cats. And it would just be sitting there intently staring at whoever haplessly happened to walk out in the dark. And it looked gaunt. It looked like it had starved to death. Another one, very emaciated. The conjecture there is that it was probably a Japanese soldier who starved to death. And it's full of rage. You could feel the rage coming from it. People would run out and, they quit the job, basically. Another one, and I know there's research on this. I happened to come across it because someone contacted me. I can't tell to this day what it is, but it looked like the Hat Man. He was wearing a hat. And you can find him coming out of a wall that separated the house from the other house, also in my grandmother's backyard. And he's tall, he wears a hat, and you can't really see his features. He's faceless.
Okay, I Anna Maria, are you messing with us? Because
No.
you literally brought up, like, in the span of 5 minutes, topics that we've talked with other people across the globe.
about.
Yes. We've never had this happen before. So we had the changeling story you brought up, and then while you were talking about the smoke getting blown, the smell of the smoke, we actually had 2 different people, and I had never heard this before myself, but even the last person we interviewed that we just released today, Heidi, she talked about getting smoke blown on her face, and she said no smokers ever in her house whatsoever. And we even talked to somebody from the South who said she had, I think it was a grandfather or something, or somebody had smoked a pipe or something, and she said she would intermittently smell the smoke in the house as a kid, even though nobody else smoked around her at all.
Yeah, it was like a resounding smell.
Fascinating. And then you literally just brought up Hat Man, which I also had never heard of until we talked to the same gentleman from Ireland, or actually it was a different person from Ireland, who talked about the Hat Man, where I guess in Irish lore they have the same figure who goes around very dark cloaked, wearing a fedora or some kind of really sleek hat, but it's clearly not human.
Yeah,
not a human being.
Yeah, this guy was basically, I forget what episode it was. It was like 58 or something like that, where one of our listeners wrote in their story of how they encountered, essentially he called it a shadow man or a hat man, for his entire life. Anytime something would go wrong, that thing would just appear, and it would be the same thing. It would be like red eyes, the hat, the appearance of a man. It's just fascinating that you brought up all of those different types of...
It comes back to what I was saying earlier with Dean, that these things tend to be universal. The encounters are not disparate. They are not in isolation. You tend to see them all different places. So it lends credence to the fact that these things really are happening. And for what reason, we don't know. But it does sound like sometimes they're predictive of something. Or they want to be there when something bad happens, is what I think. They're feeding off of the negative energy.
Have you ever heard of tulpas?
Yes.
Okay, yeah, that's another
My last book
concept.
was about a tulpa.
Oh, no way!
Right, that's awesome.
So yeah, you see, we're all clicking like this is weird. But yeah, that's fascinating too, because isn't that's also an explanation that could be happening, right? Humans are extremely powerful, and maybe some of these cases are deeply embedded or rooted in our subconscious to where we ruminate on them as a society, and maybe we actually create some of them out of the ether, whatever that means. So I don't know, maybe we can even talk about that at some point, tulpas.
Yeah, tulpas are things that if people don't realize how much they're capable of, we're technically only using 10 to 15% of our brain. But if you have someone that puts together collective energy, someone who really has a desire, okay? In my last book, there was a little girl. She was 12 years old. And she got enamored and fascinated with a demonology book she got in the public library. And this is a true story, by the way. So she started looking at all the plates, all the illustrations from this really old demonology book that she managed to borrow, of course. And she shares it with two of her friends. And the three of them are like praying to this one picture. So they're like picturing this thing coming alive. She's a sketch artist. She sketches it. She has tons of sketches in her bedroom about the thing. And, it comes alive. And it interacts in a very nasty way, causes accidents and everything else to happen. People don't believe the power of our own mind. When you're deeply like wishing for something, sometimes your wishes do come true. And sometimes they come in the form of something that's alive or can be seen for a period of time. There's a lot of research on that. Even at the turn of the century, there was an anthropologist. She was a woman. She went to Tibet to study how to conjure a tulpa. And
Wow.
it actually came out in a friendly monk, this very jovial monk that, could be seen for about several weeks. And it was all just meditation, concentration, and just a very deep desire to create something, or what they call manifest something.
Right. I'm an avid believer in that. I really do think that's legitimately a thing, that people can conjure up these things in their mind, and it just like they just hyper fixate on it. Like if you, I think, and I could be completely wrong about this, but I think if you move into a home, let's say a new construction home, there's no Indian burial grounds, there's no dead Japanese soldiers buried there, nothing, and you just hyperfixate on the fact that your home is haunted, I truly believe that some people can manifest like poltergeist activity or something of that sort if they focus hard enough on specifically that only thing.
Well, Chris, it's interesting that you say that, because paranormal investigators, they will routinely ask the question, is there a teenager in your house? And if the answer is yes, they are kind of wondering, is the teenager troubled? Are they very creative? Is there something they're going through right now? Because teenagers have been known, because they're going through, a lot of changes. They are highly imaginative, but they're also highly emotional. And a lot of these tulpas are created by very strong emotions. So they can cause poltergeist activity. At least that's what I think.
So I have probably two quick questions.
Yeah.
My first question is, what are your thoughts on Ouija boards, and have you ever used one yourself?
What are my thoughts on it? My thoughts on it stem from the one experience I had when I was in college, which was actually made it into a book, believe it or not. It had to do with an antique chair that I purchased, and it was at what you would call a swap meet or a flea market. It was for $36. It was a beautiful antique chair, and I didn't know it came with an attachment. So the person who was attached to it apparently loved the object. I brought it to my dorm room. And at the time, I didn't have a roommate, and people started telling me a woman was coming out of my room and that she needed to sign in because we're not allowed to have visitors. And I kept telling the room advisor, I don't have a visitor. And they said, oh, are you sure? It looks like she could be your sister, but she's wearing these strange flappers. I'm like, from the 1920s. So, cutting it short, I ended up trying to get rid of the chair, and a friend of mine who was into a Ouija board said, no, let's try and contact her first, find out what she's about, why she's attached to the chair. So I ended up taking it to this beach house where my friends were located, and we dragged it into the living room. And she then promptly opened an Ouija board. She lit a candle, did all the whole thing, took a glass, the glass shattered. And then the wind blew inside the entire beach house. We had taped it because, back then we were poor. You had to put plastic on the windows, and it was like the middle of winter. All the plastic tore up and all the wind came in. Windows all opened at the same time when they were asking all the questions. Who are you? Why are you here? Why are you inhabiting the chair? So My suggestion to people is that use it with a lot of caution. Know that whatever is coming through is probably not going to be your uncle or your loved grandmother. It probably is something else. Or it could be a tulpa. I mean, everybody wants to move, that little, whatever they call it, and they want something to appear. But 9 times out of 10, it's nasty.
No, I wholeheartedly believe that. Our previous episodes, Dean has always had to pull me back and say stop ranting because I go off on people that use Ouija boards and think it's a fun, like, children's toy. But I'll go ahead and ask our final question for today's show and this is a question I like to ask all of our guests. And
okay,
essentially, why do you think that people that encounter paranormal experiences, for example, let's say you have an individual that throughout their entire life, they encounter some sort of paranormal experience throughout their entire life, like over and over and over. But yet, when you ask them, do you believe in ghosts? Do you believe in this? Do you believe in that? The answer will always be no, because I've encountered people like that. And why do you think that folks do that?
I think that whenever someone is resistant into opening their mind to an experience like that, until they learn to accept it and delve into it and understand why it's happening, they will continue, roll tape, to have the experience over and over again. And it's not just with the paranormal, it could be with anything. Like if people are stubborn, they will be tested. They will continue to have the same experience until they finally, eventually accept it. A lot of people out there don't believe that the Ouija board has the potential, speaking of Ouija boards, to bring in some entities that you don't want. And they keep hammering at selling it, decorating it, or doing whatever they want to do with it until one day they become very sick or something happens, like lose their job, and they can't explain why. So, there's always a cautionary tale about why you're resisting something. And I think when you resist it, that's when it keeps knocking on your door.
Anna Maria, thank you so much for being on the show today. Why don't you,
Thank you.
share with our listeners where they can find you, where they can find your books if they want to get a hold of them?
Okay. My books can be found on Amazon under my name, or if they want to Google the title Haunted Heirlooms, that's my bestseller. It's easy enough to remember. I can be found on Facebook. I can be found on Instagram, which is how you found me, at the Sinister Archives. I am also on TikTok at the Sinister Archives. I will be doing book fests at the end of the month on May 26th. I will be local at Act 2 Books. It is a book fest where they have over 70 local authors. I am also going to the Cryptid and Paranormal Festival in Palin, New Jersey, in person to sign all my books. And my upcoming release is coming out on June 12th. It's called Against the Forbidden Darkness. And thank you for having me on.
Thank you so
Thank
much,
you so
Anna
much.
Maria. We
Been a
really
blast.
appreciate it. We'd love to have you back on for more UFO talk if you're willing.
No problem. I definitely will come back.
Thank you for tuning into today's episode of The Wandering Road. If you enjoyed today's episode, please give us a rating on Apple, Google, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. And please share the show with your friends, as that would help us grow immensely. Also, be sure to follow us on social media. You can find us on TikTok at twrpodcast, our Instagram at twroadpodcast, and our Facebook by searching for The Wandering Road Podcast. If you'd like to get a hold of us, you can reach us at our email address, twroadpodcast@gmail.com. We would love to hear from you. We would love to have you on the show as a guest so you can share your stories, or you could submit email submissions of your stories that we could dedicate an episode to. Thanks, and we'll catch you on the next one.